Welcome to all of you joining us live in the Carlos Museum at Emory University, and welcome to our large live-streamed audience from points far and near. I'm Carla Freeman. I'm the director of the Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry, and I'm absolutely thrilled to officially launch the center's annual theme for 2024-25, Democracy, Past, Present, Future, with two of the nation's leading voices on politics and the history of democracy, the nation's authoritarianism and the vote. Professor Steven Levitsky, David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and Professor of Government at Harvard University, and Emory's very own Professor Carol Anderson, Robert Woodruff Professor of African American Studies. Today's keynote and discussion marks an exciting beginning for the Fox Center as we highlight the importance of interdisciplinary humanities with an annual theme designed to attract students and faculty scholars within and beyond the gates of Emory, to animate debate and create space for deep thought, scholarly writing, and creative expression around a central concept. Of course, we knew a year ago when our executive committee chose this theme to anchor the year, that more than half the world would be experiencing consequential elections. And that discussion of democratic backsliding, conversations of democratic backsliding were everywhere. I must admit, in reading some of Professor Levitsky's most recent writings and hearing his remarks in our seminar discussion just this afternoon, that I've been combing them for some shreds of optimism. It feels as though with every passing week, the fragility of democracy is staring us in the face, and the relevance of this event feels ever greater. The two figures joining us today probably require very little introduction, so I'm going to keep my bios brief. Professor Steven Levitsky is a scholar of Latin American politics and a comparativist who analyzes democratization and authoritarianism, political parties, and the role of weak and informal institutions. As an undergraduate, he majored in Soviet studies and earned his graduate degrees in political science. He's the author or editor of 13 books, and I won't name them all here, but just to mention and to recommend a couple: How Democracies Die, which is familiar already to many of you and has been translated into 25 languages, and Tyranny of the Minority, Why American Democracy Reached Its Breaking Point, are among his recent and most timely works. Both scholarly and accessible, masterful in comparative reach, and profoundly prescient. In these two books, Levitsky and his co-author Daniel Ziblatt situate the American erosion of democracy amid a comparative frame, observing that the threats to democracy today are marked less by violent coups or military takeovers than by more subtle and legal democratic backsliding. By their account, this decay reflects a whittling away of social norms and a hardening of political opposition, where rivals view one another less as reasonable opponents than as dangerous threats, legitimating a turn to authoritarianism. In the US context, our Constitution, moreover, plays a central role in this democratic erosion. They observe while, quote, societal diversity, cultural backlash, and extreme right parties are ubiquitous across established Western democracies, in no other has a violent coup been mounted by a defeated presidential candidate, unquote. Reading their work alongside that of Carol Anderson, and their books make excellent companions, I would say, one element that I sense distinguishes them, at least in degree, is the surprise Levitsky and Ziblatt express over the January 6th violent insurrection, an assault Carol Anderson reads as squarely within the arc of American history, and in particular, its history of bureaucratic, racist violence. In addition to countless academic articles and book chapters, Professor Levitsky is also a bold public voice around the themes of democracy and authoritarian rule. He publishes in the New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post, the Miami Herald, among others. He's a celebrity on college campuses, and our crowd today attests to that. I recently caught his interview with Jon Stewart on The Daily Show, and I would say we're very fortunate to have him here today. The forum for this afternoon will be a keynote by Professor Levitsky, followed by a commentary and discussion with Professor Carol Anderson, known to all of us in this room and beyond. And even though we do all love and know Carol, let me say just a few words about her. Professor Carol Anderson brings her unbridled curiosity and courage to shine light on our nation's painful and shameful historical record around race. In her award-winning books, White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide, One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy, and the second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America, she exposes the powerful myths and strategic legislation that have been mobilized to suppress civil rights and thwart social justice for African Americans, other minorities, and the poor. As one of Emory's most prominent public scholars, we have all no doubt benefited from Carol Anderson's writing in major news outlets and appreciated her plain-spoken candor in interviews with every major news channel and across the nation's campuses. I caught her just this week on Democracy Now!, interpreting the recent presidential debate. And in her spare time, when she's not teaching or writing books, she's sharing her expertise with policymakers and testifying before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. I want to end my introductions by emphasizing the role these two figures are playing in the lives of our students, and to say how happy I am that many of our undergraduates are here today. I've witnessed firsthand the transformative effect Carol Anderson has in the classroom. I've heard her students' testimonials, even years after graduation. One, just recently, detailing the history of redistricting and gentrification on voting access in Atlanta. Professor Levitsky exudes an equally passionate commitment to his students. I say this as it took close to a dozen attempts to arrive at a time and a date for today's gathering, and the parameters were entirely constrained and accommodating the demands of both of the class schedules of these two committed teachers. Steven Levitsky and Carol Anderson have become essential voices, essential teachers, and the very embodiment of why scholarship matters, why history matters, why the humanities matter. Before turning over the mic, I want to mention just one other event to add to your calendars, and please take out your pens or your phones. On October 23rd at 6 p.m., in collaboration with the Guardian newspaper, the Fox Center will host two panels with three Emory experts, Professor Carol Anderson, Professor Bernard Fraga, and Professor Emeritus Alan Abramowitz, along with three Guardian journalists. The title of the event will be The Fight to Vote, the Past, Present, and Future of Voting Rights in America. And finally, I want to extend my sincere thanks to our co-sponsors, Latin American and Caribbean Studies, History, Political Science, the Hightower Fund. I want to thank the staff of the Michael C. Carlos Museum who host us today, the Fox Center's Executive Committee, and our amazing Fox Center staff, May Veloso-Lyons, Kaylin McAdams, and Carl Mary Acre, who have worked tirelessly to make this event possible. So without further ado, I welcome Professor Steven Levitsky to the podium and look forward to his address and a lively discussion to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. Thanks to the Fox Center for this invitation. It's really an honor to share the stage with Dr. Anderson, whose work I deeply admire. A couple of quick clarifications before we start. First of all, this is important, I did not major in Soviet studies. I don't know a damn thing about Soviet studies. But no, I know it's a mistake that my RA made that I don't know where that came from, but so I don't know Soviet studies. I'm really an amateur in the study of American politics. I'm new to the study of American politics. My expertise is in Latin America. So this idea of my being surprised at things that Professor Anderson has known for a long time, that may be a running theme today. Okay, the United States is experiencing what political scientists call democratic backsliding. All of the leading global democracy indices have registered a decline for the United States since 2016. Just to take one example, Freedom House has a global freedom index that scores all countries every year from a low of 0 to a high of 100. A decade ago, the US got a score of 92 out of 100, which put it broadly on par with Canada and Japan and Germany. Today, the US score is 83. Still a democracy, but tied with Romania and below Argentina. That may seem shocking to some of you, but when you've got widespread efforts to restrict access to the ballot, when you have violent threats against election workers, elected officials, judges, and prosecutors, when you have an attempt by an incumbent president to overturn an election, you fall to the point where Freedom House considers you less democratic than Argentina, because those things don't happen in Argentina. It may get worse after November. Donald Trump has been pretty clear about what he will do if he returns to the White House. He tells us that he will use the Justice Department to investigate and prosecute rivals and critics. He tells us he will use the power of the state to go after independent media. He tells us he'll use the army under the Insurrection Act to repress protest. And he tells us that he'll order the deportation of between 15 and 20 million people. I can think of few other candidates anywhere in the world who have been this openly authoritarian in their campaigns. Hugo Chavez, Viktor Orban, Erdogan, they never said anything like this during their campaigns. Now, this was not supposed to happen. Social scientists, we don't know a lot, but we've discovered two seemingly rock-solid facts about democracies. First of all, rich democracies never die. The wealthiest democracies ever to break down, Argentina and Hungary, had per capita GDPs of about $17,000 in today's dollars. The United States is 4 times wealthier than that. Second, seemingly rock-solid fact about democracies is that old democracies never die. They're not like humans. So no democracy over the age of 50 has ever broken down. Even if we date the birth of U.S. democracy at 1965, which is when we achieved full suffrage, U.S. democracy was over 50 when Trump was elected. So we ought to be safe. We are not safe. So in Tyranny of the Minority, Daniel and I try to understand why we are not safe and why U.S. democracy seems to be going off the rails. We argue that the United States is undergoing an unprecedented transition, a transition to a truly multiracial democracy in which a majority ethnic group loses its dominant status. That transformation, which is arguably unique among the world's democracies, has triggered an authoritarian reaction among a minority of Americans. But that's only part of the story. Our Constitution, we argue, is exacerbating the problem by empowering that authoritarian minority. I want to take each of these problems in turn. The principle, the most imminent problem that we face is that one of our 2 major parties has abandoned its commitment to democracy. Just to be clear, political parties that are committed to democracy, what the political scientist Juan Linz called loyal Democrats, parties that are committed to democracy, have to do 3 things. They have to always accept the results of elections, win or lose. They must unambiguously, under all circumstances, reject political violence. And they must break completely with violent or anti-democratic forces. The first 2 of these principles, accepting election results and violence, are pretty straightforward. I want to spend a minute on this third one, breaking with anti-democratic forces. Individual leaders cannot kill a democracy on their own. They need accomplices among mainstream politicians. These accomplices are what Linz calls semi-loyal Democrats. Semi-loyal Democrats. Semi-loyal Democrats look, dress, talk, mostly behave like everyday politicians. Hard to spot them in a crowd. But they differ, importantly, in how they respond to authoritarian threats, particularly threats in their own ranks, in their own camp. When anti-democratic forces emerge on their own flank, politicians who are committed to democracy do 3 things. First of all, they publicly, unambiguously condemn undemocratic behavior, even if it's their own allies. Secondly, they expel anti-democratic forces from their ranks. They refuse to nominate them. They refuse to support their candidacies. And third, they are willing to join forces with pro-democratic rivals from across the political spectrum in order to isolate and defeat the authoritarian threat. This is Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger in the current context. Semi-loyal Democrats do none of these things. Rather than publicly repudiate anti-democratic behavior on their own flank, they downplay it, they justify it, or they simply hide under the table and remain silent. They didn't see the tweet. Rather than expelling anti-democratic extremists, semi-loyalists tolerate, accommodate, sometimes nominate them. And crucially, semi-loyalists refuse to work with partisan or ideological rivals to defeat anti-democratic extremists, even when democracy is on the line. Now, semi-loyal Democrats, and you can probably stick some names to this notion by this point, aren't actually trying to kill democracy. They're basically just ordinary politicians trying to get ahead. They're trying to stave off a primary challenge or stay out of Sean Hannity's crosshairs. But semi-loyalists are crucial accomplices to authoritarians. When mainstream politicians, when mainstream parties start to tolerate or condone anti-democratic forces, they normalize them. The media start to treat extremists like ordinary politicians. Donors who once shunned them decide it's okay now to fund their campaigns. Leading consultants and pollsters start returning their phone calls. And of course, voters take them more seriously too. A very clear lesson from democratic breakdowns in Europe in the 1930s, Latin America in the 1960s and 70s, is that when mainstream political parties of the center left or the center right begin to tolerate, accommodate, flirt with anti-democratic extremists, democracies get into trouble. Why am I saying all this? Since 2020, the Republican Party has violated all three of these core principles of democratic behavior. Not only was Trump the first president in the history of the Republic to refuse to accept defeat and try to overturn an election, but crucially, the vast bulk of the Republican Party leadership went along with it. A group called a Never Trump group called the Republican Accountability Project evaluated the public statements of all 261 Republican members of Congress at the time to see whether they made a statement that cast doubt on the legitimacy of the 2020 election. 86% of them cast doubt on the election. Wasn't just Trump. Republican politicians have also begun to flirt with political violence. Trump and his allies now openly embrace the January 6th insurrection and insurrectionists. During the 2022 campaign, the New York Times found more than 100 Republican ads in which candidates brandished or fired semi-automatic weapons. I can think of no other major party in any established democracy in which candidates so openly embrace violence. Finally, semi-loyalty is now pervasive within the Republican Party. Republican leaders knew that Trump lost the 2020 election, and many of them actually were privately troubled by his anti-democratic behavior in the wake of the election. But they enabled it anyway. They protected Trump by refusing to impeach and convict him. They blocked creation of an independent commission to investigate the January 6th insurrection, and they are backing almost unanimously his presidential candidacy in 2024. Not every Republican is an authoritarian, but refusing to accept election results, flirting with political violence, and endorsing an openly authoritarian candidate are clear signs of a party that is no longer fully committed to democracy. So why the hell is this happening? Why would a mainstream conservative party that's been competing peacefully for elections for 150 years suddenly turn away from democracy? We argue that it is fear of losing. Now, nobody likes losing. But for democracy to work, parties have to be able to live with losing. They have to tolerate losing. When parties or their constituencies can't live with losing, when they perceive losing to pose an existential threat, they radicalize and they often turn against democracy. Think about the Southern Democrats after the Civil War. Reconstruction was this country's first experiment with multiracial democracy. It brought widespread Black enfranchisement, and African Americans were either an outright majority or a near majority in just about every Southern state. So the almost immediate enfranchisement of African Americans terrified Southern Democrats and their supporters. Not only did Black suffrage threaten the Democratic Party's electoral dominance, but it threatened the entire racial order. And for many Southern whites, that felt like an existential threat. To quote South Carolina's white supremacist governor, Ben Tillman, he declared, and I quote, "We felt the very foundations of our civilization crumbling beneath our feet." He's describing Reconstruction. That we were sure to be engulfed by the black flood of barbarians who were surrounding us and had been put over us by the army under the Reconstruction Act. Southern Democrats responded to the prospect of multiracial democracy in the 1860s and early 70s by turning against democracy itself. One Mississippi Democrat rejected what he called the offensive theory of majority rule, saying it would be like placing our necks under the foot of a veneered savage. A North Carolina Democrat declared, "We cannot outnumber the Negroes, so we must either outcheat, outcount, or outshoot them." And that is exactly what the Democrats did. They used a combination of violent terror and election fraud to seize power across the U.S. South. And then they entrenched themselves in power by using a combination of poll taxes, literacy tests, and other measures to wipe out African-American voting rights. Unwilling to lose, Southern Democrats stripped the right to vote from nearly half the population, ushering in almost a century of authoritarian rule in the South. We fear that something similar is happening to the Republican Party today. The roots of this phenomenon lie in the civil rights reforms of the 1950s and 60s, America's second experiment with multiracial democracy. Civil rights revolution, as you all know, generated a fair amount of resentment among white voters, particularly here in the South, where white voters were overwhelmingly Democrats. The Republicans were a minority party back in the 1960s, but white resentment over civil rights created an opportunity for the Republican Party to expand its base among disaffected whites. So beginning with Goldwater, continuing with Nixon, continuing with Reagan, the Republicans spent a generation explicitly targeting racially conservative, eventually white Christian voters. And it worked. They did it very successfully. In a little more than a generation, 30 plus years, Southern whites flipped from being overwhelmingly Democrats to being overwhelmingly Republican. The Republican Party, in effect, became the party of white Christians. They won the white vote in every presidential election since 1968. That continues to this day. And because the US electorate was still overwhelmingly white and Christian in the 1970s, 1980s, even 1990s, the Republicans became the majority party. The Republicans won every single presidential election between 1968 and 1988, with the sole exception of the Watergate election of '76. That's a pretty good run. But the strategy eventually ran into trouble, because at the same time that the Republicans were establishing themselves as America's white Christian party, America was becoming less white and less Christian. The percentage of Americans who self-identified as white and Christian fell from 80% in 1976 to 43% in 2016. That posed two threats to the Republican Party. The first, and most straightforward, was electoral. It became increasingly difficult for an overwhelmingly white Christian party to win national majorities in the 21st century, which is why the Republicans have only won the popular vote once in Taylor Swift's entire lifetime. Why is that my benchmark? Not clear. In 1980, Ronald Reagan won 55% of the white vote. That translated into a landslide 44-state victory. 32 years later, 2012, Mitt Romney won 59% of the white vote, still lost the election. When Republican politicians realized that they were winning the white vote but losing the American vote, they started to panic. And that is roughly when Republican-controlled state legislatures began to pass laws, again, making it harder for people to register and vote, the latest round of voter suppression. But the problem went much deeper than just losing elections. For much of the Republican Party's base, America's transition to multiracial democracy felt like an existential threat. White Christians are not just any group. For 2 centuries, they occupied the top rung of this country's social, economic, political, and cultural hierarchies, right? They were the politicians, they were the judges, they were the CEOs, they were the university presidents, they were the football coaches, the newspaper editors, the TV talking heads. All the way through my flippin' bar mitzvah, every single president and vice president in this country, every single Speaker of the House, every single Senate Majority Leader, every single Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, every single Federal Reserve Chair, every flippin' governor, every single Fortune 500 CEO, and every Miss America was white. All of that is now ending rapidly and relentlessly and right before our eyes. The number of Black and Latino members of Congress has more than quadrupled since my bar mitzvah, from 28 in 1980 to 114 today. For the first time in history, the percentage of African Americans in Congress equals the percentage of African Americans in the overall population. African Americans are not underrepresented in the US Congress today. In 1965, of course, all 9 Supreme Court justices were white men. Today, 4 out of 9 are white men. 6 out of 9 are white. And the change extends well beyond politics. We see it in the growing presence of non-white and multiracial families on our TV and movie screens and television commercials. We see it mounting societal pushback against acts of racism. Think of the Black Lives Matter movement. And we see it in challenges in newsrooms and in classrooms to historical narratives that downplay or ignore America's racist past. The early 21st century, the last 20-ish years, have seen an unprecedented assault on this country's racial hierarchies. But when your group has been at the top of that racial hierarchy for 250 years, challenges to that hierarchy can feel very threatening. Losing one's dominant social status can feel like an existential threat. Many Trump voters feel like they are losing their country. They feel like the country they grew up in is being taken away from them. And that sense of loss has pushed many rank and file Republicans toward extremism. Poll sponsored by AEI, I think 3 years ago, found that 56% of Republican voters agreed with the statement that the traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to save it. 56%. Now, the Republicans' radicalization would pose less of a threat if the United States were like other democracies, where electoral majorities prevail. Trump and MAGA have never, not for a single day, represented a majority of Americans. In fact, I think for the first time in history, a majority of Americans now embrace the core principles of multiracial democracy, diversity, and racial equality. More than 60% of Americans consistently tell polls or agree in polls with the statement that the growing diversity of our society makes America a better place to live. A solid majority of Americans supported the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. A recent poll found that more than 60% of Americans agree or think our schools should teach kids about America's history of racism, even if it makes kids uncomfortable. The United States now has a multiracial, small d, Democratic majority. But that new multiracial Democratic majority has hurled itself against some of the world's oldest and most powerful counter-majoritarian institutions. A little political science, I'm sorry. Counter-majoritarian institutions are essential to democracy. Modern democracy absolutely requires the protection of minority rights. Not everything can or should be up for grabs in an election. As Justice Robert Jackson famously put it, some domains must be kept beyond the reach of majorities. Daniel and I argue that 2 domains in particular must remain beyond the reach of majorities. The first is civil liberties and civil rights. Civil liberties like the right to vote, freedom of conscience, free speech, freedom of association and assembly and protest must be protected from the whims of the majority, pretty basic. A second domain that has to be kept from the whims of majorities is the democratic process itself. Elected governments cannot be able to use popular majorities or parliamentary majorities to entrench themselves in power. They can't use their majorities to pass laws that would weaken opponents or undermine fair competition. That's the sort of tyranny of the majority that we saw in Venezuela and in Hungary. So we need to have mechanisms that protect the democratic system from majorities that would subvert it. So civil liberties and the right to fair competition are essential minority rights. That's why we need institutions like the Bill of Rights, an independent judiciary, maybe with constitutional review power, and relatively high barriers to constitutional reform. But not all counter-majoritarian institutions are essential to democracy. Remember, we forget this in this country sometimes. Democracies are supposed to empower majorities. So just as some domains must be kept beyond the reach of majorities, other domains must be within reach of majorities. One such domain is elections. Those with more votes should prevail over those with fewer votes in determining who holds political office. I can't think of a theory of liberal democracy that justifies any other outcome than that. The second domain that arguably should remain within the reach of majorities is legislation. Those who win elections should govern. Partisan minorities should not be able to permanently veto regular legislation backed by parliamentary majorities, provided that legislation doesn't violate basic rights. So institutions that prevent electoral majorities from winning or prevent electoral majorities from governing, I would suggest are not essential to democracy. In fact, they're antithetical to democracy. The US, as it turns out, has an unusual number of these not so democratic counter-majoritarian institutions. The Electoral College, which allows losers of the popular vote to win the presidency. A severely malapportioned Senate, which provides equal representation to all states regardless of the number of people who live in those states. The Senate filibuster, which allows a partisan minority to permanently block legislation backed by the majority. And a powerful Supreme Court with lifetime tenure for justices, which allows justices appointed in one generation to thwart majorities for generations sometimes to come. Now, Americans tend to view these counter-majoritarian institutions as sacred. They tend to view them as part of a carefully crafted blueprint for a republic designed by our framers. That, of course, is a myth. The framers were not trying, they were smart folks, but they were not trying to design the perfect republic. They were trying, in some desperation, to hold the Union together. The Articles of Confederation failed, and the framers were desperately trying to forge an agreement that would prevent the embryonic Union from collapsing into anarchy, into violence, and potentially inviting a foreign invasion by the French or the Brits. An agreement like that among the 13 disparate former colonies required a lot of improvisation and required a lot of negotiation and compromise. It required concessions. Madison and Hamilton, two of our brightest framers, strongly opposed giving each state equal representation in the Senate. They opposed it. But when Delaware and other small states threatened to bolt the Union, they had to compromise. Madison didn't like the Electoral College. Madison wanted Congress to select the executive, like today's European parliamentary democracies. Madison was also sympathetic to the idea of direct presidential elections, but that was vetoed by Southern slave states. The Electoral College was total improvisation. It was a third best alternative when all the other alternatives were voted down. The Senate filibuster was also not part of the framers' vision. Madison and Hamilton opposed supermajority rules for the Congress, and supermajority rules were not included in either the Constitution or the original Senate. They emerged later. The filibuster emerged later thanks to an oversight in the early 19th century by Senate leaders who were cleaning up the Senate rules. It emerged basically as a product of an accident. My point is that key counter-majoritarian institutions like the Senate, like the Electoral College, were not a product of brilliant or foresighted design. They were a product of a negotiated pact, not unlike democratic transitions in Poland, Chile, South Africa, where powerful undemocratic forces demanded extra protection as a condition for giving up power. But whereas most of the counter-majoritarian concessions that were made in Poland during its transition, in South Africa during its transition, in Chile during its transition, most of those counter-majoritarian concessions were temporary and soon eliminated. America's counter-majoritarian concessions were entrenched. They became permanent features of our political system. And those permanent features now threaten our democracy. The concessions made to small states in 1787 built a bias into our political system. It overrepresented sparsely populated territories. The Electoral College favors sparsely populated states. The US Senate heavily favors sparsely populated states. And because the Senate approves Supreme Court nominees, the Supreme Court is also somewhat biased towards sparsely populated states. That rural bias has always existed. That rural bias has always been undemocratic. But it never seriously advantaged one party over the other, because for most of this country's history, both major parties had urban and rural wings. So it effectively balanced out. It's only in the 21st century that US parties have really split along urban-rural lines. So today, as you all know, the Democrats are overwhelmingly concentrated in metropolitan areas, while the Republicans are overwhelmingly based in smaller towns and sparsely populated territories. That gives the Republican Party, through no fault of its own, a systematic advantage in the Electoral College, in the Senate, and the Supreme Court. And that advantage allows them to win and to hold national power without winning national electoral majorities. You guys know the data. Republicans have won the popular vote for president once since 1988. They've governed the country for about half that period, or for half the 21st century. A popular majority was not enough for Joe Biden to win the presidency. He had to win the popular vote by about 4 points. Had he won by 3 points in 2020, Trump would have been reelected. Same thing is happening in 2024. According to my man, Nate Silver, if the election were held today, Kamala Harris would win the popular vote, likely win the popular vote. Trump would likely win the presidency. The Senate is even more skewed. Senators are elected to staggered 6-year terms. A third of the chamber is up for election every 2 years. That means it takes 3 elections over a 6-year cycle to fully renovate the US Senate. The Democrats have won the overall popular vote in every 6-year cycle since the year 2000. Yet Republicans have controlled the Senate for half that period. In recent years, this varies election to election, but the Democrats have needed to win the popular vote by about 5 points to retain control of the Senate. So even if the Democrats consistently win 51, 52% of the popular vote for Senate, Republicans will likely retain control or win control of the Senate. Composition of the Supreme Court is even more skewed. 4 out of 9 Supreme Court justices were confirmed by senators representing less than half the US population. 3 of them were nominated by a president who lost the popular vote and were confirmed by senators who represented less than half the population. This is minority rule. Think about it. In 2016, the loser of the popular vote won the presidency, and the party that won fewer votes won control of the Senate. That president and that Senate went on to nominate and confirm 3 Supreme Court justices, dramatically shifting the court to the right. If electoral majorities determined control of the Senate and the presidency, like in other democracies, the Supreme Court today would have a 6-3 liberal majority. Now, minority rule is, I think, a uniquely American problem. In no other established democracy can partisan minorities thwart electoral majorities as consistently or as consequentially as in the United States. Why is that? Counter-majoritarianism used to be widespread. Back in the 19th century, Latin America, Europe had all sorts of undemocratic institutions. They had monarchies with real power. They had unelected legislative bodies. They had electoral colleges and other indirect elections. They had all sorts of filibuster-like mechanisms through which parliamentary minorities
could thwart majorities. But over the last century, over the last 120 years or so, other democracies gradually shed their pre-democratic institutions. Britain weakened the House of Lords, stripping it of veto power. Denmark, Sweden, New Zealand, Portugal got rid of undemocratic upper chambers or Senate-like bodies. Germany, Austria, Belgium democratized their senates by making them more proportional to the population. Canada, France, Britain, other democracies established cloture rules allowing simple majorities to end parliamentary debate, so no filibuster-like mechanism. All European and Latin American democracies established either term limits or a retirement age for their Supreme Court justices. And every other presidential democracy on the face of the earth got rid of its electoral college. Argentina was the last one in 1994. So other democracies have gradually become more democratic over time, eliminating 18th and 19th century institutions that allowed partisan minorities to systematically thwart majorities. Only the United States also undertook democratizing reforms. It did so to a much lesser degree. And so only the United States has retained many of its pre-democratic institutions. So today, the United States, again, is the world's only presidential democracy with an electoral college, the only one where the loser can win the presidency. We have the most malapportioned Senate on earth, except for Argentina and Brazil. No other democracy allows a congressional minority to routinely veto legislation backed by a majority, and the U.S. is the only established democracy with lifetime appointments to the Supreme Court. We need to democratize American democracy. In our book, Ziblatt and I propose 15 reforms that would help to ensure that electoral majorities in this country actually win power and govern. That includes a constitutional right to vote, automatic voter registration, abolition of the Electoral College, democratizing the Senate by eliminating the filibuster and giving more populous states greater representation, and term limits for Supreme Court justices. Most of those reforms are highly unlikely to happen, but it's worth pointing out that these are not radical reforms. Everything I just suggested exists in most other established democracies, making it easier to vote, abolishing the Electoral College, eliminating the filibuster, term limits for Supreme Court justices would simply bring the United States in line with most other established democracies. It would make us a mainstream, middle-of-the-road democracy. Americans have a long reformist tradition, from the Bill of Rights to the abolition movement, to the Reconstruction reforms, to the women's suffrage movement, to the progressive era, to the civil rights era. Generations of Americans have worked to make our system slowly more democratic. But over the last half century or so, going back to the 70s, we've stopped doing that work. We need to get back to our country's reformist tradition. If we don't, we risk a slide into minority rule. The United States today stands at a crossroads. We will either be a multiracial democracy in the 21st century, or we will not be a democracy. Both of those roads, I think, continue to lie before us, and there's clearly no turning back. I'll end there. Thank you.
So I'm just going to ask some questions because your book was fabulous, fabulous. When you said we stand at the crossroads, either America will be a multiracial democracy or will not be a democracy at all. And I thought, what happens when the GOP base believes it has to give in to fear of a multiracial democracy, rather than it's more fearful of a multiracial democracy than it is of a dictatorship, than a Putin-like dictatorship, because that's where we are. And is it that we have, as a nation, softened our understanding of a dictatorship and what living under a dictatorship will be, so that it becomes palatable for the GOP base that fears this multiracial democracy?
I don't know what's going on in terms of Americans' fear of authoritarianism. I've spent a fair amount of time in traveling to Brazil and in conversation with Brazilians who have gone through a pretty parallel process in recent years. They had their own Trump-like figure get elected in 2018, lose his reelection bid,
and try to overturn the election. So sort of frighteningly similar. I won't get into it now, but I think Brazilians have actually responded in a much more serious and effective way than Americans have. My co-author, Daniel, spends a lot of time in Germany, has had a lot of conversations with Germans who are also, even though I think they face less of a threat to their democracy right now, are much more concerned. And I don't have a great sense about why Americans seem so unconcerned. I think part of the story is that for most Americans have just never, not only never lived the loss of a democracy, but never even imagined it. I think societies that have lost a democracy and have lived in the last few generations under authoritarianism have a greater sensitivity. But it also may be the fact that, at least for some Americans, the kind of discourse that Trump is using and the kind of and the kinds of behavior he's engaged in and the behavior he's condoned is not unfamiliar. I mean, we've had authoritarian pushbacks against democratizing movements before, particularly, but not only in the US South. So I don't have a great answer, except to say that it does seem to me that American citizens are sleepwalking. And our elites, not just our citizens, but our elites, even more importantly, are sleepwalking. Religious leaders, business leaders, politicians in Brazil, in Germany, elsewhere, are speaking out against threats to democracy in a way that some of our religious and business leaders certainly are in this country, but most of our top business leaders are kind of laying low. Most religious leaders, Catholic leaders who have denounced authoritarianism in Brazil, have denounced authoritarianism in Germany, have remained silent here. So I don't have a great answer beyond that.
Part of what I think we're looking at is American exceptionalism. That kind of sense, oh, it can't happen here, but it has happened here. When we think about the Jim Crow South, the Jim Crow South was an authoritarian regime. You had a one-party system that relied heavily on violence, that had that basically trashed the schools, that determined what could be taught. So, like in Mississippi, the schools for Black children did not mention the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, or the 15th Amendment. So basically it was telling Black children that they weren't American citizens with the rights of American citizens, but they were in fact Mississippians with the rights only that Black folks in Mississippi could have. And that is, basically those were Dred Scott kind of rights, the rights that no white man was bound to respect. And so Black folks have lived it. And I think that that's part of why you see the kind of engagement of African Americans, particularly older African Americans, who see the threat, who have been warning about the threat, except they have not been taken seriously because of the power of American exceptionalism, because of that sense, so that hasn't happened here because we have whitewashed Jim Crow so that it was just signs of white only and colored only. Instead, you don't see the full degradation. You don't see the full incredible power that came behind Jim Crow and the way that it eviscerated humanity, the way that it eviscerated lives, the way that it eviscerated rights. We don't have that full knowledge yet, that full history, and that full comprehension of the power of an authoritarian rule, because it felt like it hasn't touched their lives. And because American exceptionalism, again, is such a powerful drug. And I do mean that. I mean, a drug, like, I want a new drug. So that drug is so addictive that it inures those to the dangers that stand before them. So he can talk about, I want to be a dictator on day one. And they're like, oh, isn't that cute? And so like I heard Chris Cuomo say today, well, it's not that Trump wants to be a despot. So when you have an anchor, a newsman, saying it's not like he wants to be a despot, and then you had Brian Tyler Cohen going, well, actually, and then just going down the line of all of those things that Trump has threatened to do, including the mass deportation of human beings, and including the shooting of protesters and using the U.S. military to go after Democratic-run cities. that's a despot. But again, that kind of sense of, not really. I mean, and that's, I think that's also what you mean by it hasn't penetrated to the highest level like it should.
Yeah, just a couple of things. American exceptionalism may be a strong drug, but it's a weird and changing drug because, as American democracy inches, I think inexorably towards multiracial democracy, there a set of MAGA voters have grown increasingly uncomfortable with championing the United States, increasingly uncomfortable with our multiracial Olympic teams and national soccer teams, and with our democracy, a democracy that elects that puts a Black family in the White House. And so folks who 30 years ago would have been, championing that American democracy is the greatest in the world, are now preferring Viktor Orban. Hungary is a pathetic, tiny country. And these folks are holding up Hungary and Russia as a model for the United States. That may be American exceptionalism. It's a very different American exceptionalism than we saw 30 or 40 years ago. One other point on Trump as a despot. I mean, Trump is about, I don't get many things right in politics ever, but as a Latin Americanist, I recognized Trump's authoritarian instincts, I think, before many. This is a guy who would have been very, very comfortable in Somoza's Nicaragua. I mean, he truly believed and was very frustrated to learn that the institutions of the U.S. state were not available for his personal and political use, right? That we actually have a state that he can't naturally control. So his authoritarian instincts are very clear. But again, it's really, really important to remember that Trump couldn't get anywhere without the Republican Party. On his own, Donald Trump is powerless. It is only with the acquiescence, the cooperation of the bulk of Republican Party leaders that he can do damage. And so when we issue blame, there's obviously a lot of blame to go around for Trump, but it is mainstream Republican leaders who, at the end of the day, will cost us our democracy.
Amen. So that leads me to my next question. In the book, you talk a lot about basically the accomplices and democracy's assassins who look so regular, who look so normal, who are in their Brooks Brothers suits, but who are doing enormous damage. So you've got democracy's assassins have always have accomplices, political insiders who appear to abide by democracy's rules, but quietly assault them. And I think about the folks who are doing voter suppression, who are figuring out how to put these barriers in front, particularly of folks of color. How do you, voter ID laws? How do you closing polling places in Black and poor communities? So many rules, all designed to put up these barriers to the ballot box and to make it look like they're protecting democracy while they're absolutely eviscerating the rights of American citizens to the ballot box, to the right to vote. So here's my question. How do we hold democracy's assassins and accomplices accountable?
Let me briefly punt by pointing out that in doing some of the comparative research for this book, I had not been as aware of how unique the U.S. is in the particular instance of voter suppression. That is a really American tradition. In the vast majority of democracies in the world, the state bureaucracy, and all governments assume that people should vote. We live in a democracy. It should be easy to vote. So most democracies vote on a holiday or a Sunday, and most governments have
easy registration, often automatic registration, so that when you turn 18, it's easy for you to vote. That's what in almost any democracy that you check out in Europe or Latin America, that's the case. Sometimes it's obligatory to vote. So this notion that the government would actually put obstacles to voting, which obviously goes way back there, says that's a really American thing. It's very hard. So it's very hard to hold the accomplices to democracy's demise accountable, because what was it, the Reagan administration that came up with the term plausible deniability? Is that from the Reagan era? Semi-loyal Democrats usually have plausible deniability. They didn't pull the trigger. They may have allowed it. They may not have known. They didn't see the tweet, right? And so it's in not all cases, but in many, many cases, you didn't vote for Trump's conviction in the Senate. Maybe you just didn't want to pay the political price of doing that. Trump gets reelected, and further Democratic backsliding. Is it your fault because you didn't vote to convict Trump? Yes, but how do you hold somebody like that accountable? So I think the obvious answer, not very interesting, is they need to be held electorally accountable. I don't think they can be held legally accountable. I think they can be held politically accountable. And the problem is that, and the reason why we obsessed with this issue of semi-loyalty in the book, is because people generally don't think about that. They don't think about the role that Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy play in making Donald Trump possible. And again, they will never be held legally accountable, but they sure as heck ought to be held politically accountable.
I agree. And I think about the U.S. Supreme Court's recent decision that the president has basically total immunity for so-called official acts. And so this is where you're looking at the power of a minoritarian system that is, in fact, entrenching minoritarian rule. And it's the way that you're having a judge throw out the case dealing with the the classified documents. So, when you have nuclear secrets in your bathroom, and I used to have a security clearance. I used to do the State Department stuff. And you didn't play. And they didn't play. You had a document and it wasn't where it was supposed to be, you're gone. And so to see just boxes after box after box of those documents and just watching him skate, that leads me to my other question. Aren't you loving this?
It's not getting any easier.
So one of the things I also thought about is that we've talked about how voter suppression, the impact that it has on people's access to the ballot box. What do you think, though, that a system that does not hold wrongdoers accountable, that does not hold the assassins for democracy accountable, what does that do in terms of giving a sense to a broader swath of people that the system is so messed up that it doesn't matter if they vote? What impact does that have on the question of apathy that we're seeing in fact, in terms of low voter turnout? We've had something like 80 million people who didn't vote last time.
Yeah, fortunately, at least in my view, voter turnout is higher in recent decades than it was when I was younger. When I was in the late 20th century, voter turnout was much lower. So one of the, I guess, is it a silver lining? Or I don't know if it's a silver lining, but of our polarization is that not enough, but more Americans, including more younger Americans, are engaged are in fact voting. But I take your point. Excessive counter-majoritarianism leads to all sorts of outcomes that are out of whack with public opinion. So it's impunity for criminal or undemocratic behavior is certainly one thing that can sort of push people away from politics. But Supreme Court rulings that are dramatically at odds with generations of public opinion, legislative outcomes when it comes to abortion or minimum wage or gun laws that are way out of whack with public opinion, also leave, and maybe most dramatically of all, when the loser of the popular vote semi-routinely wins the presidency, which is, if you are a millennial or Gen Z, that's your reality, right? All of those things can lead people, I think particularly young people, to think, you know, I'm not living under a democracy. What is Levitsky talking about? What is there to stand up and preserve?
And this is why I've got to say we have a class called Imagining Democracy, which is really about how do we get greater civic engagement. I've got some of my students here right now, greater civic engagement and thinking through how do we make this democracy work? How do we make it viable? How do we have people out in the community engaging members in the community so that they know that they have a stake in this democracy? They have a stake in the viability of this nation. Because when we fight, we win. Next question. So when I think about the founding and how you had the little states like Delaware and Rhode Island arguing and basically teaming up with the slave states, what you're looking at is a sense of a lack of trust in the system. That I've got to do this because if I don't protect myself, then Virginia, because Virginia was a big dog. Virginia was like California and Texas combined back then. Virginia was a big dog because Virginia's going to run things. Virginia's just going to have our tail all the time. How do you build trust in a system? Because I think that is foundational to a viable democracy. That building of trust where people, because so many of the minoritarian features to me are really about a lack of trust. So you've got some wonderful pieces in there about the right to vote, term limits for Supreme Court justices, ending the filibuster. But how do we foundationally build trust in a democracy?
Oof. I'm honestly not sure how to do it, particularly in terms of institutions. Our book focuses on rule changes, sometimes constitutional, sometimes non, that could make our system more democratic. That would not necessarily do anything for trust. I mean, this is not an area where I've done research or know the research very well, but there are at least three structural things that all things equal help trust, none of which we have in the United States. One is simply small size. Larger countries are harder to sustain trust. We're kind of stuck with a big country. I'm missing one. So another one is inequality. There's pretty good evidence that lower levels of socioeconomic and socioeconomic inequality and racial inequality foster trust. That little homogeneous communities are easier, all things equal, to build trust in than diverse communities. So we have a real challenge in the United States. Not only are we very big and very diverse, but we're also, unfortunately, very unequal. Now, we're not going to change the size of the country. We're not going to change the diversity of our country. One thing that we can at least try to combat is the level of socioeconomic and racial inequality. And I think once people can, from the upper strata and lower strata of society, can minimally recognize one another as members of the same community, that makes trust, I don't think that guarantees trust building, but it makes it a bit easier. So that's where I would start.
Love that. Going after issues of inequality in the society become foundational to making the society begin to function better. And I think that one of the things is that we're looking at the issue of a multiracial democracy. And we know that every time that, and you've laid this out beautifully, every time we've gotten close to a multiracial democracy, the backlash has been intense. And one of the things about these multiracial democracies is that they have gone after issues of inequality. So we see this coming out of Reconstruction, where you had the Black congressmen and Black legislators working on issues of a public school system to make sure that there was a viable public school system, understanding how important education was. Then there's Wilmington in 1898, Lord have mercy. There you have what's called a fusion government, where you have African Americans and whites basically power sharing in Wilmington, North Carolina, and they have a vision of democracy. And this is during the rise of Jim Crow. They have a vision of democracy that deals with education, that deals with equality in terms of voting, that deals with real good public services for everybody. And they were taken out. There was a nasty, bloody coup of white supremacists who wiped out that fusion government. And they said, they issued what they called the Declaration of White Independence and said, we are going to choke Cape Fear with the carcasses of Black bodies. And they did. And that multiracial democracy is the other thing that we saw with Obama's election. So with Obama's election, you saw the rise of right-wing militias. You saw the rise of gun sales. You saw the rise of the right in a kind of virulent form to take on this multiracial democracy, that fear of a Black man and a Black family in the White House. How can this be? Whitney Dow did a wonderful study where he interviewed whites who looked at Obama and Obama's family, and their fear was intense. Their hatred was intense about this family, because how could there be a Black family in the White House? And so they talked about their anger at seeing Christmas cards coming out of the White House with this Black family. What were they doing in the White House? And so the reality of that, I think, is part of what we have to work on, dealing with the kind of inequality and getting folks used to, so what they say, when you're used to being on top, getting rid of oppression, getting inequality looks like oppression. And so that's why you hear a lot of victimization from those who have consistently have had the lion's share of resources in this nation. One of the things you also talked about when you're talking about the Republican Party is that when the Republican Party can hold on to power without broadening beyond its radicalized core white Christian base, it will remain prone to the kind of extremism that imperils our democracy today. Karl Rove and W. tried in 2006, 2007 to broaden that base because they recognized that the Republican base was very, very white and American demography was not. And they got the Voting Rights Act, the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act through in 2006. Then they went after immigration. And the backlash was intense. And then when you saw the rise of the Tea Party. Then you saw after Romney's defeat in 2012, the GOP did what they called the autopsy. And the autopsy said, okay, we have got to broaden our base. We can't just be the white man's party. We can't be. And so we need to broaden our base. We need to soften up on immigration. We need to really reach out to diverse groups. We need to do that. And the response was Donald Trump. So here's my question. The issue with the far move to the right of the GOP really appears to be an entrenched extremist base that it has to adhere to. What do we do about the base? Because that, as long as that base is absolutely violently opposed to democracy, absolutely violently opposed to a multiracial democracy, absolutely violently opposed to an America that doesn't look like Russia, an America that doesn't look like Hungary. What do we do with that base? Because as long as there's that base, and we can't get the Republican Party, because they've had multiple opportunities to expand their platform, to expand their policies. But whenever they've tried, there's been this massive backlash to the right, driving them further to the right.
Boy, the question's getting easier and easier. First of all, I can't resist going back to this this point about a African American family in the White House sending out Christmas cards. Just wait till we have a Jewish guy in the White House sending out Hanukkah cards. And the next, the first what is it? The first gentleman.
Yeah.
Look, there are various competing theories about what to do about that base. Now, you know, Trump and Republicans will win 46, 47% of the national vote. Not all of those are you know, hardcore ethno-nationalists. It's you know, closer to 30%, a third of the electorate. And what do you? So one theory which sounds great to me, but I'm very skeptical about, is the sort of what you see in multiple factions of the Democratic Party, including the Sanders faction, is that, you know, with material benefits for the white working class, we can bring them around. So reduce inequality, you saw it in Biden's infrastructure bill, you see it in Bernie Sanders' message. The Democratic Party has forgotten the white working class, which is true. And it just goes after the white working class with material benefits. It can steer the white working class away from identity politics towards sort of center-left economic program, which could induce many of them to vote for the Democratic Party. I unfortunately, and that has been experimented with. That is, we have tried that. I haven't seen much evidence that it works. I'm deeply skeptical. Unfortunately, I wish that theory were true. I'm skeptical that it is. The alternative then, I mean, there are a couple of things. The alternative, which is equally difficult, is that the Republican Party needs to be beaten so badly electorally that it's forced to rethink its strategy, that its leaders are forced to adopt a different strategy. Now, our electoral rules make that really tough, and a two-party system makes that really tough. And we particularly never Trump Republicans, who are fewer and fewer, but never Trump Republicans. I mean, that's their thing. We just need to beat the crap out of them electorally so they'll be forced to change. That's also proven really, really difficult. What is the road out? I mean, first and foremost, and this is probably as illusory as the two theories I just gave you, but there's a lot of responsibility here that in the hands of Republican elites, right? If Republican leaders have a basic civic responsibility to tell the truth to their followers, and they've been demagoguing on race and culture and identity as a way basically to win primaries, to advance politically within the party, at great cost. So if conservative media elites and Republican politicians were actually to tell the truth to their base, that would make more of a difference in gradually shrinking the size of the rejectionist coalition than anything else we could do. That's also unlikely to happen given the incentives of primaries in the United States. What might happen, so in the medium run, two things can happen. First of all, the hardcore MAGA base is going to continue to shrink, at least as a white Christian base. You may have a sort of radical populist base, but that base is going to be more multi-ethnic in the future. So the numbers may eventually compel the Republican Party to adapt. They didn't have to in the early 21st century. You know, in a couple of decades, they're going to have to follow a different strategy. They may also, and this gets back to your point about the multiracial Democratic coalition and inequality. The Republicans may actually back into a more multiracial coalition. What do I mean by that? The multiracial Democratic coalition, at least as I see it, is a coalition that might combat racial inequality to a degree, but is not necessarily poised to combat economic inequality. It's a coalition of non-white voters, and for the most, and educated white voters, white voters who are doing okay with the status quo, doing okay with a socioeconomically stratified
status quo, winners under globalization and contemporary capitalism. The white voters in the multiracial Democratic coalition are more racially tolerant. They're more racially liberal. They're not necessarily out there for high taxes and heavy redistribution. So, as we saw in the Obama era, you're not necessarily going to get serious movement towards socioeconomic equality under this coalition. So, there is a lot of discontent with the status quo for a bunch of reasons. I think COVID had to do with it. I think social media has to do with it, but there's a lot of grumpiness in electorates throughout the West. There is an anti-incumbent bordering on anti-system fervor among a lot of voters, particularly not very engaged voters across racial and ethnic divides. There are white voters and brown voters and black voters who are pretty pissed off at the status quo. And the Democratic Party is not necessarily, which is a very establishment option, is not a particularly attractive place for a voter who's really pissed off at the status quo. As we saw particularly in the late Biden period, the late Biden candidacy, but we're still seeing it. I think we will see in this election. There are a growing number of voters across the racial divide who are just want to say F you to the system, and Trump and Trumpism and MAGA to a degree are a vehicle for an anti-system vote. Neither Joe Biden nor Kamala Harris is maybe a change candidate, but it is not a rejection of the status quo. Trump is a punch in the gut to the system. And if you're just really not very happy with the status quo, that's your vehicle. And we may see, and we're already seeing to a degree, I think it's been overstated in the media, but we see to a degree, Americans of all kinds kind of circling behind that more populist alternative. So there is a world, and we were heading more rapidly in that direction with Biden as candidate than we are now, but there's a world in which MAGA wins a decent number of non-white votes simply because it's a populist option that's promises a wrecking ball to the system. And so it may be that the Republican Party eventually backs into a more multiracial coalition, which could even, I don't think it will this time, but could even win a national majority, which would have a couple of effects. In the short term, it might make Republican leaders less fearful of democracy if they can win because they have non-white votes. And eventually, the hardcore white supremacist core constituency of the Republican Party might be diluted. I'm searching here, grasping for straws, looking for ways out. How do we get out of this sort of hardcore MAGA core that's so destructive of democracy? If Republican elites don't do it, this sort of backdoor strategy may be our best option.
Because one of the things that I thought about was in the 1930s, when you started seeing African Americans leave the Republican Party and move over to the Democratic Party because of FDR's New Deal. And so then you had black folks sitting in the same party with these Southern Democrats, and the Southern Democrats are looking up going, what? And you had the power of the Great Migration that moved African Americans out of the South and into these big electoral college states, like in Illinois when they moved to Chicago, and like to Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania, and when they moved to New York City and to Cleveland, Ohio. You started seeing them putting enormous pressure on their politicians because of the power of the black vote there to begin to address the issue of civil rights. And at a certain point, the 1948 presidential election, because there was so much pressure put on Harry Truman, because Harry Truman was not FDR, and he was so not FDR, and so and so everybody was like, "Oh, son, you're going to lose this election. You don't stand a rat's tail worth of a chance. You're getting ready to lose big." And so you saw him beginning to make feelers out to issues of civil rights, and you had that incredible 1948. Democratic National Convention, where Hubert Humphrey comes to the podium and he says, "It's time we got out of the shadow of states' rights and moved into the bright sunshine of human rights. And the crowd went wild. And the Southern Democrats got up and they walked out and they formed the Dixiecrat Party. And that began the beginning fissure of ending the power of the solid Democratic South. So to me, what should have happened then is by the time we get to 64 in Goldwater, what should have happened was that the Republicans, the Democrats were already like, okay, son, see ya, bye. The Republicans should have said, see ya, son, bye. And that hardcore anti-Black right wing should have been left to the fringes of American society. The problem was that toxin then was able to inculcate itself into the Republican Party. And the Republicans thought that they had the power, that they could control this toxin of virulent white supremacy. They thought they could control it and get the votes in Congress to get their conservative agenda through. You can't control white supremacy. It's too toxic. It's kind of like the way that the German conservatives believed that they can control Hitler. And they found out soon that they couldn't. And so part of what has happened is that virulent piece has moved the Republican Party further and further to the right, and it has driven the moderate Republicans out. And so being able to have Republican leadership now that can stand up to that base, because that base drives the primaries, means that it's really, really electorally difficult. And so to me, part of what has to happen is that we have to have the kind of society that says, there's no place for you to do that mess here. And to set that norm, to make that norm so strong and so clear, because a viable democracy requires a multiracial democracy. And I really believe that if the United States can pull this thing off, that will be so beautiful. That'll be so beautiful to me, because it will show the rest of the world, this is how we do this. It is possible, it is feasible to have a democracy that is multiracial, that is viable, that is exciting, that is engaging. We can do this.
Yeah, that would make us a model for the world.
Yes.
It would make us a model for democracies like whether it's Brazil, India, Indonesia, other really diverse societies, which, believe it or not, are worse off than we are in terms of racial inequality.